Hello again, drifters. Tonight, we follow the silent threads spun by the Sisters of Fate, ancient weavers of every life's beginning and end. Let their timeless presence guide you into deep rest. If you enjoy these mythic journeys, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps keep the stories flowing. They were three, and they held the fate of every living being in their hands. The Moirai, the goddesses of destiny, who ruled over the lives of men and gods alike, determining the length, direction, and end of every mortal journey. They were called by a name that meant parts or shares, for each person received a portion in the grand design, a thread that was uniquely their own. The first was the spinner, who began it all by twisting the thread of life into being from nothing, turning her spindle with calm certainty as she brought each soul into existence. Then came the apportioner, who measured the thread with her rod, deciding how long it would be, how far it would stretch, and what course it would follow through joy or sorrow. And finally, the third, she who could not be turned, waited in silence with her shears, and when the time was right, she would cut the thread and end the journey. At every birth, they stood unseen and set the thread into motion, whispering to one another and weaving the path of that life as it unfolded. They were not cruel, but they were firm, allowing mortals to shape parts of their path through choice and will, yet always bringing things back to the point where the thread must eventually break. Though Zeus was their guide and called Lachesis, even he could only bend fate at the edges, saving those on the brink if he so wished, but never undoing what had already been cut. They worked subtly, never forcing their hand upon the world, instead moving through causes and consequences, letting events unfold by design, not by interruption. Sometimes a man, though bound by fate, could delay or shift the course by his own actions, but never escape it entirely. When death came, the thread was already worn thin, and in that moment, the Moirai, once the guardians of life, became the guide to death, standing beside the shadows that rule the underworld. They were impartial and unstoppable, watching over all things, even gods, making sure no one stepped beyond their destined path. Not even Zeus or the others could stand above the laws the Moirai upheld. They gave the Furies their roles, assigning punishments and making sure justice flowed alongside fate. And though the gods might argue and plead, the Moirai listened only to necessity, obeying laws older than Olympus. They worked alongside the goddess of childbirth, since they were there when life began, foretelling what that life would hold before the baby took its first breath. They knew the future as clearly as they knew the past, and sometimes they let it slip in riddles or signs through prophets and seers, who acted as their messengers to the world of men. They did not walk alone. The oracles and the voices from sacred places were their tools, revealing parts of the pattern to those who dared to ask. But when life ended, they came again, this time not with a thread, but with death at their side, joined by the black-winged spirits and the avengers who punished wrong. In this darker form, they were seen near the end, their faces cold, their eyes without pity, and their hands unshaking. They were often imagined as withered and ancient, far removed from warmth or comfort, old women with hunched backs and stiff limbs, walking slowly through the shadows. Sometimes they limped, as if to remind the world that their path was never rushed. Each held something that showed her role, one with a spindle or a scroll, another pointing to the stars and the shape of a man's birth, and the last with blades or scales or a wax tablet, watching time pass with quiet finality. Their tools were strange and symbolic, sometimes staffs like rulers, other times crowns like queens. But whatever they held, it meant power, and none could deny it. At every birth they appeared unseen, spinning, measuring, and cutting with silent precision. In Rome, they were known as the Parcae, and their names shifted to Nona, Decima, and Morta, but their essence remained unchanged. Their power echoed through all cultures that imagined fate as a force too strong to break. They had many parents in the stories, for different poets gave them different origins. Some said they were born of Zeus and Themis, embodying divine law and justice. Others claimed they sprang from night alone, or from the union of night and darkness. Some called chaos their origin, others the stars in the river, or necessity itself. But no matter where they came from, their place remained fixed. They stood at the beginning and the end of every tale. Their names were always the same in essence: the one who spins, the one who measures, and the one who cuts. Some called the final one Isa, a name that simply meant fate, and through all stories and all time, they remained there, quiet and certain, weaving the threads of every life, watching, waiting, and finally snipping the string that held it all together. Moira, in its purest sense, meant to share, and from this simple idea grew one of the deepest concepts in ancient thought: the deity who gives to every person their destined part in life, the unseen force that governs not only the span of a mortal's years, but also the direction and limits of each soul's journey. In the earliest tales, especially those told by Homer, there was not a trio of fates as later imagined, but only one Moira, singular and absolute, who carried out the work of shaping each life from birth onward. This single Moira, though not always clearly shown as a full-bodied goddess, was still powerfully present, appearing at the moment a child was born, silently spinning the thread of their future. From that moment on, she would follow their steps, closely watching and guiding the unfolding events of their life, not through force, but by linking each action to the divine counsel above. In Homer's view, she was not set apart by distinct features or lineage, no description of her appearance, no parent's name, just a force both known and unknowable, whose presence was felt but rarely defined. Sometimes she was called Isa, another name for the same function, hinting again at how the ancient mind saw these forces not as distinct beings but as intertwined truths of existence. There is even a passage where Moira is suggested to be one of the Cataclothes, the spinners, though some believe this term refers to the Eilithai, the goddesses of childbirth, which would suggest a closeness between the act of birth and the beginning of fate. Over time, the image of Moira shifted. While once there may have been only one, the unfolding nature of her role, controlling the beginning and end of life, led some to imagine two, one for birth and one for death. At Delphi, this idea of dual Moirai was honored, fitting the sacred space's deep concern with prophecy and life's turning points. From there, it seemed natural that three figures would eventually form, each carrying a specific task, spinning the thread, measuring it, and cutting it. This division, however, was not always strict, and in many poems and stories, all three were described as spinning, even though that act truly belonged to the first alone. In some verses, the name Clotho alone stood in for all three, acting as a symbol of the whole system of fate. She was seen at work with her spindle, turning life into thread, pulling it out slowly and carefully, while her sisters, when mentioned, would either guide the length or bring it to a close. As bringers of birth, they worked beside the goddess of childbirth, who was named their companion and helper. For it was at that moment of entering the world that fate attached itself to the soul. They were there not only to spin, but to speak, for they could also foretell what that newborn's life would hold. In this way, they were not just servants of time, but also speakers of the future. Prophetic beings who could reveal destiny before it happened. Sometimes they were even connected to Prometheus, the shaper of mankind, for it made sense to believe that those who created life would also set its course. Their most well-known symbol was the spindle, held in Clotho's hand, showing the very moment life began its motion. But the idea did not stop there. The same thread could be broken, snapped suddenly, or cut with care, marking the end, and this brought death into their domain as well. They watched over the first breath and the last, standing at both gates of life. Because of this, they were seen as both beginnings and endings, and as such, they were revered and feared. As goddesses of fate, they held the knowledge of all things yet to come, and though they did not always speak of what they knew, they had the power to do so. At times, they gave their voice to the world through signs, omens, or dreams, or through the mouths of prophets who caught glimpses of the pattern behind the veil. Their knowledge was certain, unchanging, and precise. They did not guess or hope. They simply knew. When poets described them, they gave them many forms, but often they appeared as old women, weary with time, their eyes seeing more than others could bear, their hands steady and unshaking. Sometimes all three were seen holding the thread, together working silently in rhythm, bringing each life from start to finish. In their company, life was measured, destiny was revealed, and nothing was left to chance. Their presence was not always loud, not always seen, but in every tale of birth, in every whisper of death, in every warning from a seer or sign from the stars, their thread ran quietly underneath. They did not need to speak, for the world itself followed their design. As goddesses of death, the Moirai appeared not alone, but alongside other figures of the underworld, joined by the dark-winged Keres, who were known for hovering over battlefields to snatch the dying, and by the Erinyes, the avengers of blood guilt, with whom they were often associated so closely that the boundaries between them faded. In certain places, such as near Sicyon, the offerings given to the Moirai were the same as those offered to the Erinyes, showing how deeply their identities as stern, death-bringing deities were intertwined. This association with death did not stand in contrast to their role in birth, but completed it. For what they began with the spinning of life's thread, they finished when the thread was finally cut. Yet, the Moirai were not only feared and venerated for ending life, they also played a mysterious role in leading Persephone, the queen of the underworld, back into the world above, guiding her out of the shadows in company with the Charites, and sharing the path with Pluto and Charon, further linking them to the turning points between death and life, darkness and light. In this, they were not only bound to death's silence, but to the rhythm of seasons and transitions. Poets gave them many titles, almost all referring to their stern and severe nature, words that captured how fate was not gentle or easily swayed, but strong, fixed, and absolute in its resolve. Yet not all myths agreed on how fixed that fate truly was. In the poems of Homer, Moira is not an untouchable, all-powerful law before which even the gods must bend. Rather, she is subject to the decisions of Zeus himself, who as the ruler of gods and men weighs out the fate of mortals on his great scales. If he chose, he could even save those already caught in fate's grasp, showing that the thread spun by the Moirai was not beyond divine change if the will of the highest god intervened. Still, fate did not reach down with force or without cause. It worked through chains of events, through reasons and causes, through quiet influence that led to natural conclusions. Fate was not absolute, but conditional. Even a mortal, through choice and action, could shift how that fate unfolded, though never fully escape it. The final outcome was still the same, but the road there could twist and turn. When that road ended, fate transformed, and the Moirai became goddesses of death, appearing at the close of life as Moira Thanatoyo, closely bound with the idea of death itself, and often seen alongside Apollo, who brought death swiftly through his arrows. The link between Moira and death was so strong that by the end of a life, the boundary between fate and death dissolved entirely, and the name of the goddess merged with the final moment. In the older traditions shaped by Hesiod, the idea of fate became more distinct and fully personified. The Moirai were daughters of night, shadow-born beings like the Keres, standing outside the light of Olympus, and 3 in number: the spinner who began the life thread, the measurer who gave it length, and the unturnable one who made the final cut. This division gave clarity to their roles, while still preserving the unity of their purpose. In that version, they were not entirely separate from divine order, but part of a structure guided by their father, and so Zeus was sometimes called Moiragetes, the guide of the Moirai, suggesting that even these powerful goddesses followed the will of the highest god. In temples and art, they were sometimes shown together with Zeus, as seen in places like Megara, in the sanctuary of Despoina in Arcadia, and in sacred sites such as Delphi, where fate and prophecy were deeply linked. They were believed to engrave the decrees of Zeus himself onto everlasting tablets, marking not just the passing of time, but the unchangeable direction of lives, sealing destinies not in spoken word, but in markings that could not be erased. Yet not every tradition held the same view of their origin. Later, writers offered many different genealogies for the Moirai. Some said they were born of Erebus and Night. Others claimed they came from Kronos and Night, while others again gave them as daughters of Earth and Ocean. These differing origins reflected how the Greeks struggled with where fate truly began. Was it born from time, from darkness, from chaos, or from the world itself? Each version tried to place them within the greater web of myth, to explain how such powerful beings could exist and yet still serve something beyond themselves. But in all versions their function remained the same. They were the unseen hands behind every beginning and every ending, guiding the thread of every life from the first breath to the last, moving quietly through the world without ever pausing or forgetting, their purpose carved into the heart of existence itself. Sometimes they were said to be born of necessity itself, of Ananke, the force that stands behind all laws and movements in the world, and this idea gave them a place at the very heart of what was fixed and unavoidable. But the stories were never the same across time, for different thinkers and poets imagined the Moirai in many different ways. Sometimes they were strict goddesses of fate, ruling everything with unchangeable purpose, and sometimes they were more like symbols of how long a person would live, their presence marking the start and end of life without claiming power over everything in between. When they were seen as rulers of fate in its full form, they stood above all else, shaping the course of things according to laws that no one could break, and even the gods, even the one who ruled Olympus, had to obey them. They held their place at the helm of the great ship of necessity, steering the course of lives, making sure that no one veered from what had been written into the fabric of existence, and when a punishment was to be delivered for wrong deeds, they gave the Furies their role, assigning each one their target and making sure justice followed fate. Because of this, they were sometimes named as sisters of the Furies themselves, connected not just by blood, but by task, for both groups existed to uphold the balance between cause and consequence. Later writers kept this vision of the Moirai intact, showing them as powerful, somber forces, always watching, never sleeping, and never turning aside. In these stories, they were firm and untouchable, and poets told of them holding scepters or staffs, symbols of command, while in the writings of philosophers, they even wore crowns, signs of their high station. In the world of stone and sculpture, they were carved with purpose, shown not as monsters but as noble figures, young in form but serious in expression, holding the tools of their work, the first with her spindle or the great scroll of fate, the second with her staff pointing to the stars and the time of one's birth, and the third with her knife or her scales or her sundial, ready to end what the others had begun. They had temples and sacred spaces all over Greece, in Corinth, in Sparta, in Olympia, in Thebes and beyond. Places where people might offer prayers or seek understanding, though not mercy, for the Moirai were not ones to be moved by pleading. Yet the poets were not always kind in their depictions. In some verses, the Moirai were described as old and twisted women, slow in step, sometimes even lame, a way of showing how fate moved at its own pace and could not be rushed. These harsh images stood beside the more formal and noble ones, showing how people both feared and respected them, unsure whether to dread them as cruel or honor them as fair. Sometimes their tools and symbols overlapped with those of others. One of the muses, the one who studied the heavens, was drawn with the same items as the fate who measured time. And in Athens, one of the goddesses of love was even named as the oldest of the Moirai, suggesting that fate could touch all things, even desire. There was even a word, pepramene, which meant exactly what they embodied, the destined share of a person's life, and sometimes this word appeared as a name itself, standing in for fate just like Moira did. It all pointed to one truth. No matter what name they were called by, or how many forms they took, they remained the keepers of life's portion, the ones who gave and the ones who ended. In the oldest songs, their family tree was traced back to the highest god and to justice itself. One poem told how, after marrying the goddess of wisdom, the god of the sky took a second wife, Themis, the one who stood for order, and from this union came the hours and the forms of law and peace, and also the Moirai, who were given the greatest place of honor. These three, the spinner, the measurer, and the cutter, were said to hand out both good and bad to people, for their job was not to bless or curse, but to allot, to divide, to share out the time and fortune each soul would carry through their days. And in another poem, their role continued, always steady, always present, shaping the story of every person who walked the earth, from their first breath to their last. Clotho and Lachesis stood above, their presence commanding but quiet, and though smaller in size, Atropos stood beside them, not tall in height, yet older than both, carrying with her the final authority among the three. She was not the largest, but she ranked the highest, and what she ended could not be undone. These three, known as the Moirai, were said to have been born in different ways depending on the tale. Some told that they came from Themis, the daughter of heaven, joined with the god of thunder and rule, and from this union came the hours, peace, good order, and justice, as well as the Moirai, Clotho who spins the thread, Lachesis who measures it, and Atropos who cuts. Others, older stories still, told that they were born of night itself. In the deep shadow where no god lay, night gave birth alone to many forces, doom and death, sleep and dreams, blame and misery, and then also the Moirai and the fierce Keres, who brought death in violent form. It was night who gave them life, not needing the touch of any other, and from her also came retribution, deceit, friendship, old age and strife, all the companions of fate who walked alongside men in silence or in pain. In these versions, the Moirai were the daughters of darkness, and at birth they gave to mortals a mix of what was bitter and what was sweet, deciding what each soul would carry in its hands. One fragment from an ancient poem called them fair-armed daughters of night, and named also Isa, the dispensation, alongside Clotho and Lachesis, as part of their sacred circle. They were described by others too, not only as sisters of night's other children, but as sisters to the avengers of guilt, sharing a mother and sharing the duty of keeping balance in the world. In one tragic play, they were addressed directly as sisters of the Furies, united not just in blood but in purpose, guiding the consequences of deeds and the end of lives. In a sacred hymn, they were called by name again, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, shaped by the night's darkness, holding fate within their hands. The Roman writers also remembered them. One listed them among a long and heavy list of those born from night and darkness: fate, old age, death, toil, dreams, love, and many others who made up the unseen forces behind human experience. The Fates, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, stood among them as the Parcae, the Latin name for the same unchanging spirits. Another voice, speaking from Rome as well, repeated the names of those ancient beings, saying that the Fates, along with misery, fear, death, and love, were the children of the shadows, born of darkness and night, and that the same darkness gave rise to deceit, complaint, and even favor. There was one more telling of their birth, not from night, but from necessity itself. A philosopher wrote that the Moirai were born from Ananke, the force of compulsion or inevitability, and he described them wearing white robes with bands around their heads, named again as Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos. These different versions, some saying they came from divine order, some from the night's silence, and some from the very force that drives all things. Each gave a different view of how the Moirai were placed within the world, but in all of them, they held the thread of life and marked its shape, whether born from Themis or from night, whether daughters of order or of darkness, whether shaped by necessity or raised by the stars. They did the same work. Clotho began the spinning, drawing out the thread of each life with her hands. Lachesis came next, measuring how long it would be, deciding how much time, how much experience, how many joys and sorrows each thread would carry. And finally, Atropos, smallest in height but greatest in power, stood waiting with her shears, and when the thread was done, she cut it. She did not delay, and once she had made the cut, no god, no plea, no act could return it. The thread would fall and the life would end. These three were always together, no matter where they came from, no matter what name the poets or philosophers gave their mother, and they worked as one. They were the end and the beginning, the length and the depth, the hidden rhythm that every mortal followed without seeing the thread in their own hand. They did not speak much, but their silence was filled with meaning, and their work shaped the whole world. Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos sang in harmony with the voices of the sirens, each one weaving a thread of sound through time itself, not with chaos, but with order and clarity. Lachesis sang of the past, all that had already happened and could no longer change. Clotho sang of the present, the moment being spun even as she held the spindle. And Atropos, silent and small yet older than the others, sang the future, the inevitable that was yet to come. In this way, their music echoed across time, each note fixed in place by the work of their hands. Some ancient voices even said they were not born of light or rule or night, but of chaos itself, emerging from the void as daughters of chaos, shaped not by form but by the very absence of form. Others claimed that they were born of the sea, daughters of the ancient waters, moving slowly and with heavy steps, described as lame and holding the triple thread in their hands. In that version, they were closer to the Graiai, the old grey sisters who shared one eye, and their link to the sea made them timeless, patient, and unyielding. Their place in the divine order was never easy to define. At times they sat near the highest throne, attending the god who ruled Olympus, and were said to be under his leadership, answering to his wisdom and guidance. In one telling, they were given the highest honor by the ruler of gods, who placed them beside his seat and trusted them with both good and bad, and for mankind. In another, they sat closest of all the gods to his throne, weaving countless destinies with unbreakable shuttles, their work too fine and too vast to be escaped. Some poems called them the daughters of night, with arms fair and firm, steady in their task, trusted by the very God who saw all things. In one place, a temple showed them above the head of the thunder god himself, along with the seasons, suggesting that even time and rule flowed beneath the vision of fate. At Olympia, an altar bore the name Moirai, meaning bringer of fate, and all knew that this was another name for Zeus, who understood what the Moirai gave to each mortal and knew what was still to come. In Arcadia, a shrine to Despoina showed fate and its guide together in stone, carved side by side, with no confusion over their connection. At Delphi, the seat of prophecy, there stood not 3 images of the Moirai, but only 2, and beside them stood Zeus and another god, both given the name Moirai, the guide or leader of fate. A hymn once praised fate as the perfect and eternal eye of the god, saying that both he and fate saw every action, that no deed escaped their sight. In another story, when the ruler of the heavens spoke, the Moirai clapped their hands in agreement, and even the light-stepping seasons sneezed, a sign that something great was coming. But not all stories agreed that the thunderer led the Moirai. In one old tale, he did not command them, but instead was bound by them, held in place by their law. In that telling, they stood above even him, and all his power could not undo the work of their hands once it was done. This division between being their master or their servant revealed the mystery of fate. Was it shaped by will, or was will shaped by it? And still the Moirai sang, and still they spun, and still they measured and cut, unmoved by worship or question, whether born of night or chaos or sea or necessity, whether seated near the throne or standing above it. They did not change. They were always 3. One spun the thread, pulling it from the unseen and making it real. One measured the thread, setting how long it would last. One cut it, ending what had begun. They never traded tasks, and they never failed. They did not rush, and they did not wait. They moved in silence, or they sang, and the world moved with them. Every life passed through their hands. Every god watched their work. Every temple that honored fate also honored the truth that no one escaped it, not even those who ruled the skies. Their names were spoken in reverence. Their statues stood in sacred halls, and their threads stretched across the world, unseen but unbroken. They were the singers of time, the daughters of the first void, the last voice in every story. The question was asked, who guides necessity itself? Who stands at the helm of what must be? And the answer came clear and strong, that it was the Moirai, shaped in three forms, who steer the course, joined by the Furies, who remember every wrong. Even the greatest of gods, the one who held the thunder, could not stand apart from what they had written. He could not escape what had already been foretold. Though his strength was vast and his voice ruled the skies, he too bowed before the order set by the Moirai. In one tale it was said that everything came to pass, not just by divine will, but by the ordinance of the Moirai. No other power, not even the combined strength of the gods, could undo what fate had decided. When the war raged in Troy and prayers rose into the sky, the allies of the city, even among the immortals, could not turn the tide. Because Isa, the goddess of destiny, had spoken, and once her hand moved, not even the son of Kronos could stay it. Her strength rose above all others, and even when he sanctioned her work, it was not because he commanded her. It was because he too followed what she decreed. When Minos, given a golden scepter and appointed as judge in the underworld, stood in honor, it did not save him, Diwam. He too could not escape the verdict of the Moirai. Though placed high and trusted with judgment, his own fate had already been written. No favor, no power, no gesture from the gods could remove the thread already measured and cut. The gods may be moved, they may feel sorrow or pity, but even they cannot bend the iron rule set by the ancient sisters. When one god swore to grant a wish, and the wish would lead to death, he heard the plea and blamed the Moirai for what would follow. He pitied the one doomed by their own request, tried to hold back the promise, tried to shift the moment, but he could not oppose the threads of fate. Their will had already been woven, and he had no power to unmake what they had made. And long before, when the great marriages of the gods were first arranged, it was not done by their own will alone, but by the guidance of the Moirai. In one story, they brought the goddess of counsel, riding in a golden chariot from the waters of Oceanus to the high stair of Olympus. There she became the first bride of the god who saves, not by chance, but by the design of the fates. In another tale, during great celebrations and sacred rites, it was the Moirai who united the queen of the sky to the king who ruled from his unreachable throne. Their work was not only about death, not only about endings, they shaped beginnings too, and with every thread they spun, they joined together what needed to be. In matters of war and prophecy, in matters of law and truth, they stood with the forces that guarded the balance of the cosmos. Alongside the one who represented justice and order, they upheld the laws of heaven. With the river of oaths, they oversaw what must be sworn and never broken. With the avengers of guilt, they watched over loyalty and punishment. Together, they ensured that no deed was forgotten, and no promise was without weight. Their presence was always near, even when not seen, and even when not named. They were behind the choices, behind the events, behind the fall and rise of kings. Their thread wound through every story, silent and strong, unbreakable and unseen. No force, no voice, no cry could shift what they had already shaped. And even the gods, in their highest moments and deepest griefs, found themselves standing at the edge of fate's design, looking on as the Moirai moved forward, never pausing, never turning, always working in the order they alone understood. Their power did not need noise or thunder. It was written in silence, in the quiet cut of a thread, in the path set before the first step was taken. Whether bringing brides to the throne or guiding kings to their end, they moved with the same steady hand. They did not act out of mercy or anger, but out of certainty. and that certainty ruled all. When thieves dared to steal honey from the sacred cave where the great god was born, he lifted his thunderbolt in fury, and the sky rumbled with his wrath, ready to strike them down. But he was stopped. The Moirai stood in his way, and with them stood the goddess of divine order. They did not allow the thunder to fall, for it was not right that death should occur in such a place where no blood was meant to be spilled. So instead, the thieves were changed, their forms turned into birds, and their lives spared from destruction. In another moment, when two forces came together and bound themselves by solemn promise, they swore not just by the god of thunder and the earth, not just by the shining sky and the dark river of oaths, but also in front of the Moirai, who witnessed their words and gave weight to every vow. Their presence turned promises into law, and once witnessed, the bond could not be broken. In the great wars of gods and monsters, they did not sit aside. They stood in defense of the one who ruled the heavens, guarding his place and aiding his cause. When the father of the sky was cast down, and his son rose to take the throne, the old ruler called upon the ancient powers to fight. The titans rose with him, and the earth brought forth a terrible beast, one half bull, the other serpent. But fate did not favor the rebellion. The river that swore loyalty to the new ruler imprisoned the beast, warned by the Moirai. They had seen the danger, and in a black grove walled on all sides, the creature was trapped, for fate had declared that if its insides were burned, it could undo the rule of the gods. The fates had guarded the path and kept the balance from breaking. Later, when the giants came to challenge the skies, the Moirai did not only observe, they entered the battle. Armed with bronze maces, they fought alongside the gods and struck down those who threatened the heavens. Agrios and Thun, mighty giants both, fell beneath the blows of the sisters of fate. Even the monstrous storm, Typhon, who rose with many heads and tried to bring the sky to its knees, was deceived by them. As he fled from the thunder god, the Moirai met him and offered him fruit, telling him it would make him stronger. He ate it, not knowing it would pass quickly through him and give him no power at all. In their hands, even lies became part of destiny's plan. But their power was not only in battle or deception, it was also in prophecy. When the chained one who had stolen fire spoke with the chorus of stars, they asked who guided the path that none could escape. He answered that it was the three-shaped Moirai and their sisters, the ones who remembered every wrong. When asked if the thunder god had less power than they did, he said yes, for even he could not escape what had been foretold. The stars asked what fate awaited the ruler of the gods, but the answer was held back, not to be revealed. The truth was this: a child was to be born to a sea goddess, and that child, if fathered by the god of thunder, would rise higher than any before, surpassing his father and undoing his rule. The fates knew this, and the god stepped back, letting the goddess marry another. So the child was born not to rule the skies, but to walk the earth, famous in battle. Another time, when the youth who dared to ride the chariot of the sun rose into the sky, fate had already written his fall. The Moirai had not woven his thread to hold the reins of fire, and when he lost control, burning the heavens and the earth, the gods were moved, but none could stop what had already begun. The Moirai had spoken, and the course could not be undone. They watched over murder, over vows, over war, over birth, over love. They guided the rise of rulers and the fall of stars. They stood with the god of thunder and stood above him, both aiding his rule and setting its limits. They kept balance with order and memory, with prophecy and punishment. They fought when needed, warned when needed, deceived when needed. but always followed the thread they themselves had spun. What they began, they did not undo. What they spoke, none could silence. What they saw, they carried through. From vows to war, from prophecy to death, their hands held every moment, and no power, not even the greatest among the immortals, could stand against the thread they had measured and the end that they had marked. He remembered the fate that had been spoken long ago, the prophecy that foretold of a time when the sea would rise and the land would burn, when the heavens themselves, with all their shining halls, would be set aflame and fall, their high walls breaking under fire. This was not a fear or a vision, but a decree of the fates, tied to the doomed ride of a youth who once tried to guide the chariot of the sun and failed, setting the world on fire, shaking the pillars of the universe. And though the Moirai did not hold the reins of the sun, they had already written the end into the thread, and no one could stop it. They were not only present in endings, but also in beginnings, and it was by their hands that the sacred union of the sky ruler and wise order was made. From the ocean's deep stream, the fates guided her in a golden chariot, along a gleaming path that led from the waters to the high stair of the mountain where the gods dwelled. There she became the first bride, chosen by the ruler of the skies. From that union came the goddesses of the seasons, the Moirai, who marked the passing of time in balance, light, and harvest. And when the daughter of harvest was taken down into the realm below, into the shadowed world of the dead, it was the Moirai who once again took their place in the story. When the earth stopped giving its fruit and hunger spread through the lands, the one who ruled above sent them to speak with the grieving mother, to calm her sorrow and bring her back to her task. She listened to them and set aside her anger, softening the pain in her heart. The seasons began to move again, and when the time came for the daughter to return, not alone did she rise, but with the fates and the graces who brought her from the night, and in joy they formed a sacred dance in harmony, marking the rebirth of life, the blooming of the earth. Yet her return was not without law, and the god who ruled reminded her mother that the return could only happen under one rule, if no food of the dead had passed her lips. That was the command set by the fates. Their rule was not harsh, but it was unbreakable. It was they who fixed the laws that even the gods observed, deciding the rules that shaped life and death. When gods themselves were born, the Moirai were there. At the birth of the god of music and light, as the goddess let fall her belt and brought him into the world, they stood nearby, alongside the gentle bringer of birth. They were present not just as witnesses, but as those who declared what the newborn would become. When his sister was born, the goddess of the wild and of the moon, she later recalled that even at her first breath, the Moirai had spoken. They had chosen her task, to be the helper of women in pain, the one to be called when childbirth brought fear. And it was not a burden, for her mother had felt no pain when she bore her, and so she was marked as one to bring ease, chosen before she had even taken her first step. The fates declared the paths of gods and mortals alike, giving each their role, giving each their portion. Their voices were quiet, but their word was law. They guided unions that shaped the order of heaven. Earth stood firm in the rules that govern returns from death, and set the terms for what even immortals must follow. They were present in war and peace, in prophecy and vow, in joy and mourning. They watched the skies burn and the earth fall silent. They marked the time for descent and the hour of return. They spoke at the first breath of a god and the last breath of a hero. They did not choose with love or hate, but with certainty. They did not punish or reward, but measured, With their spindle, their rod, and their blade, they moved through all things, beginning, middle, and end, without rest, without pause, without change. And through every moment, high or low, sacred or sorrowful, they were there, shaping not what might be, but what must. Without pain or labor, she brought me into the world, and even at that moment, the fates were already at work. At the birth of Athena, it was Clotho who determined her path and spun a thread that would never twist toward marriage or motherhood. She was to remain untouched, a virgin in all things, bound to no man and bearing no child. And this destiny was not guessed or hoped. It was assigned by the hands of fate. And when the dark sisters were born, the ones who hunted down those who shed the blood of kin, they too were bound from their first breath. Their task had been spun by Moirai before they ever opened their eyes. When mortals committed blood crimes against their own families, these sisters pursued them without mercy, even beyond death. The gods themselves were forbidden from interfering in their work, for what was assigned to them by fate could not be undone. They moved across the land in silence, carrying the curse set for them since the very beginning. And at the founding of the sacred games at Olympia, when a great hero established the contest to honor the gods and mark his triumph, the Moirai were there as well. As time itself watched, the fates stood by to bless the right, fixing it into the order of the world. From that moment, the games would endure, tested by time and truth, and never lost. And when the island of Rhodes arose from the sea, it too was caught in the eye of fate. The god who ruled the skies called on Lachesis, and she stood with her golden band, lifting her hands to swear the oath of the gods. The land that had come to the light of heaven was then and there assigned to the god of the sun. The words she spoke, joined with the command of the king of Olympus, fell into place like seeds into the soil of truth. No one could contest it. It was decided and declared, and so it was. And on another island, the same was true. Kos, shining and rich in green pastures, was also given by the fates. It was not given by chance or favor, but because the Moirai had already decided it. The one who would rule it was not chosen by preference, but by destiny, and the island would belong to the god of the sea, not because of desire, but because the threads of fate said so. They divided the lands of the earth just as they did the years of a man's life. And in the great city of Athens, when a place was needed for the Dark Sisters, it was Zeus and Moirai together who made it so. A shrine was raised, and peace was made between the people and those who once brought terror. It was not a chance agreement. It was the will of fate. The goddess of wisdom welcomed them, and their place became part of the order of the city. The cry of welcome echoed not only through human mouths, but through the voice of destiny itself. For at every birth, the Moirai stood ready, not only for gods, but for mortals too. They spun and measured and cut with the same hands. In old tales, they were said to appear at the cradle of heroes, whispering the shape of life into the silence. When one was born to fight monsters, when another was born to hold nations together, when a third was born to rise and fall in glory, it was they who decided. Their presence at birth did not bring joy or sadness. It brought truth. They did not ask or advise. They worked. They held the power of beginnings. They shaped paths that others would walk. Their thread touched gods and men alike. From the daughter born without pain to the goddesses born to avenge, from contests of strength to islands in the sea, from temples of worship to moments of judgment. The Moirai were always there, unseen yet ruling. And every act they oversaw, every destiny they declared, was never undone. What they spun would be. What they measured would last its length. What they cut would end. And through it all, they remained as they always were, silent, steady, eternal. Hera stood before the ruler of the skies and challenged him to make a binding oath, urging him to swear that the one who would be born that very day, from his own bloodline and from the womb of a woman, would be lord over all who lived around him. And the god, unaware of her trick, agreed and swore a mighty oath. In that moment, fate seemed to lie in the hands of a god, not the Moirai, but even then, the web of destiny was already spun, and what followed revealed that fate does not yield even to those who rule Olympus. Later, in the heat of war, when gods descended to the fields below, Hera declared that although one man might be protected for a day, he would not escape the fate that had been woven for him from the moment of his birth. She said that nothing could save him from what destiny had decided and placed into his life strand on the day he was born. Another time, a mother sat in sorrow, mourning the son she had lost, and spoke of how, from the very start, when she gave birth to him, strong fate had already spun his thread to end far from home, with no family near, his body torn by beasts. Her grief was not just for his death, but for the destiny that had always been waiting for him. On another shore, a king spoke of a guest who must endure whatever was already written into the thread of his life, the portion that the spinners had twisted when he entered the world. He could not escape it, for it had been set by the fates at birth, and even a house made of bronze could not hold back the pain that was already promised. In the words of the old poets, the fates were named clearly: Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, the ones who gave to each mortal a share of joy and sorrow when they entered the world. They did not give only pain, nor only blessings. They gave what was due, what was measured, what was already part of the pattern of existence. Another voice said that these three had been given the highest honor by the ruler of the gods, for they alone distributed to humans all that they would possess, the good and the bad, and their decisions were respected by all. When the mother of the god of light and music gave birth, she was helped by the goddess of childbirth and by the Moirai, who stood nearby. They were not strangers to the moment of birth, but sacred participants, making sure that what had been assigned would be set into motion. In another song, the goddess of childbirth was described as a servant to the deep-thinking fates, working beside them when a child entered the world. A poet once told of a man who had no hope of avoiding misfortune, because the righteous fates with golden distaffs had stood by his side at birth and foretold what was to come. Even if he lived behind bronze walls and barred every door, what was meant to find him would come. Fame and good fortune, joy and ruin, all lay in the thread given by the Moirai. A voice was given to the huntress goddess, and even she remembered the moment of her own birth. She said she would come to help women in labor, for when she was born, the Moirai had already assigned that role to her. Her mother had not suffered in bearing her, and so she became one who would lessen suffering for others, not because she chose it, but because it was her thread, set by the spinners before she took her first breath. The power of the Moirai did not rise in storm or lightning. It rose in silence, in the moment of birth, when the thread was touched, when the measure was marked, when the cut was written before it would ever be made. They were there in prophecy and in pain, in sorrow and in celebration. The stories told again and again that fate was not something one ran from or bargained with. It was given by the hands of the fates, who stood unseen but unchanging, who watched all things and judged nothing, who held every life in a thread that began with the first breath and ended only when it was time. Whether it was a warrior doomed to die far from home, a child destined for greatness, or a god fated to rise or fall, the Moirai had already spoken at birth, and their word would hold. Nothing could be done to unweave the thread once spun. Nothing could be built strong enough to keep fate out. And nothing in the world, not even Olympus, stood above their quiet, eternal work. Even before the first cries of a newborn echoed into the world, the Moirai had already moved. In the hour when the goddess of the wild was born, her path was set without pain or struggle, for her mother felt no labor, and because of that, the fates decreed she would bring help to all women suffering the sharp pains of childbirth. That role was not chosen, it was not earned, it was written into her thread from the very start, and so she became their helper. When a woman wept over the fate of her son, blinded without mercy, the voice of wisdom reminded her that the deed could not be undone. The thread had been spun long ago, and the fates had fixed it from the moment he was born. In the old songs sung to honor the birth goddess, one poet called her the good spinner, joining her with the power of fate, and saying she existed before time itself, older even than the ruler of the Golden Age. Another tale told how the Moirai touched not only people, but even the divine horses of heroes. Their threads were spun to serve the god of the sea, then passed to the hands of a mortal king, and later to the unmatched warrior, and finally to his son, who would ride them not only in battle, but also into the blessed lands, the Elysian plain, after death, as fate had decreed. In the same epic, the Moirai wove long threads for other warriors, setting their course and fixing their end, not in the heat of the moment, but before their first breath. In the halls of art, even in paintings, their hands were imagined spinning the birth of a poet, as the muses obeyed their will and brought forth a voice that would echo for all time. Their power stretched beyond pain and war into creation itself. In sacred hymns, the fates were called the triple goddesses of birth, but they too bowed to the will of the goddess of love, whose rule over life's beginnings meant that even they followed her law in matters of creation. When war loomed, it was said that fate had sworn to the king of the skies, and the dark threads of the sisters had fixed that day from the dawn of the world. The people set to fight had been marked for battle since their first moment, and no change could turn that day aside. Yet in joy as well, their hands moved. A poet once called on the sisters to spin again, this time with joy, to shape a new thread of shining white, and let the past fall away, for a new life was beginning, and this day would be its first breath. Still, not every touch of fate was bright. There were moments when the cradle was brushed by the hand of Lachesis, and the child was marked for sorrow. A life short and dim was not the fault of the one who lived it. It was the way the thread had been twisted, and for a queen of the old city, whose children and people were lost, the Moirai had already spoken before her sorrow began. The tears of that queen, and of all the women beside her, were not sudden or surprising. They had been part of her thread from the beginning, set in motion by the decree of fate before she ever knew her losses would come. The Moirai did not give reasons. They gave what was fixed. Their work was not cruel, but certain. At every cradle, they appeared unseen. At every death, they watched without blinking. They spun for kings and beasts, for mortals and gods, for cities and horses and wars and poets. Their threads ran from the quiet of birth to the echo of last breath. Even love and creation, even joy and sorrow passed through their fingers. They did not stop. They did not forget. What they wrote into the thread, no one could change. Their hands were silent, their faces calm, and their eyes saw not the present but the whole. They gave the strong their glory, the weak their endurance, the lost their rest. And even as temples rose and fell, As cities burned and stories faded, the thread held. It had always held. From chaos, from silence, from the moment before time, the Moirai had worked, steady and eternal. They were the first and final touch. The thread they gave was life. The cut they made was death. And all that lay between was shaped by their unseen, unchanging hands. The burning bran out with trembling hands snatched it from the fire and hid it away in a chest as if she were locking up the life of her newborn son inside it. The three sisters had come at the moment of his birth, standing near as his mother labored, and they each sang the thread that would shape his future. One gave him nobility, the other strength in battle, but the third looked at the small log flickering on the hearth and said it clearly, that his life would last no longer than the flame on that piece of wood. And with that, the fate of Meleager was spun. As the years passed, he grew strong and brave, just as promised. He became known among men, a hero with fierce pride and unmatched courage. But unknown to many was the fragile truth that his life did not lie in his heart or bones, but in a simple bran hidden away by a mother who loved him more than she feared the fates. She guarded it like treasure, knowing that as long as it remained whole, her son would live. But the wheel of life kept turning, and with it came sorrow. In time, her own brothers fell by Meleager's hand during a bitter conflict. Rage burned hotter than love, and grief louder than memory. And in her fury she remembered the brand. Her sorrow pushed her toward a choice no mother should ever face. She opened the chest, reached for the firewood that had grown old and dark, and with shaking fingers she cast it into the flames. The fire caught, and as it burned down, so too did the life of the one she bore. Far from home, Meleager felt the strength leave his limbs. He had been fighting, his blade still warm from battle, but suddenly his body weakened. His breath shortened, his heart grew heavy, and he knew that the moment had come. His life was being taken not by blade or spear, but by something unseen. As the brand in the fire turned to ash, he began to fade. With his final breath, he wept not for pain or fear, but for the youth he was leaving behind. The Moirai had not lied. They had not been cruel. They had only spun the truth. From the moment of his first cry, the span of his days was set. The brand was not cursed. It was simply a measure. In dreams and visions, it was said that his mother had seen them in sleep, standing at the edge of the bed as she bore him, speaking clearly of what would come. She believed them, trusted their words, and acted as best she could. But fate is not undone by care alone. It waits patiently, and it always returns to claim what was promised. When she burned the brand, she did not act blindly. She knew, and still she chose. Some say it was justice, others say madness, but the thread that was spun had reached its end, and the fates did not interfere. They had given her the sign. They had not hidden their decree. The piece of firewood was never magic. It was truth, and once consumed, it carried her son with it. The story passed from voice to voice, each telling it in their own way. Some say the sisters appeared as spirits, others that they came with music. Some say the mother heard them in a waking dream, others that they stepped into her room with real feet. But all agree on this. When Meleager was born, his fate was spoken. The sisters had given their parts, one a gift of nobility, one of courage, and one of an ending marked by a flame. And no matter what wars he won, what beasts he slew, or what songs were sung of him, that flame would always be the limit. His story was not just a tale of glory, but a reminder of the quiet, powerful presence of fate at every birth. The thread can be long or short, simple or tangled, but it always begins with the hands of the Moirai. They do not shout or fight. They do not plead or promise. They measure, they spin, and when the moment comes, they cut. Meleager's brand burned out, and with it ended the life they had assigned. His name lived on, carried in the stories of those who remembered him, but he himself walked no more among the living. The Moirai had spoken, and so it was. Obstruction had been in vain. The moment the words left her mouth, the Moirai and Eileithyia were startled, and in surprise they jumped up with a cry, their arms uncrossing as they did so. At that very moment, the spell they had cast upon Alcmene was broken, and the binding grip of prolonged labour shattered like a snapped thread. Alcmene, free from the god's interference, gave birth to Heracles. Galinthias had tricked the divine powers with nothing more than clever words and fast thinking, and for a brief moment the will of Hera had been turned back. But the Moirai, angered by the deception, looked upon Galinthias with scorn. Furious that their command had been undone by a mortal girl, they seized her and transformed her into a weasel, condemning her to dwell low to the ground, birthing her young through her mouth as punishment for mocking the fates and meddling in their work. Yet this fate, harsh as it was, became a tale of cunning and bravery, for Galinthias had ensured that the child destined for greatness would be born. Years earlier, it was a different scene entirely when the Moirai had appeared before another mother, Althea, on the day her son Meleager came into the world. As flames danced in the hearth of the palace, the three figures stepped out of shadow and declared with eerie calm that the newborn's life would last no longer than the burning of a log that lay crackling in the fire. Althea, overcome with fear and love, rushed forward and seized the brand from the flames, her hands trembling as she quenched its fire. That single action, done in the desperate wish to protect her son, would bind his fate to a hidden object. She took the log and locked it away in a secret chest, believing that as long as it remained untouched by fire, Meleager would remain safe. Time passed, and the boy grew strong, brave, and bold, unaware of the object that held the length of his life. But years later, when his hands became stained with the blood of her own brothers, killed by Meleager in a fit of fury or honour, Althea's grief was twisted by the sharp edge of vengeance. The weight of the past and the voice of the Moirai from so long ago stirred within her heart like a storm. She went to the chest, her fingers brushing its surface with hesitation and fury. As she opened it, the brand lay there unchanged, but the purpose it carried now felt unbearable. With sorrow and anger swirling within her, she prepared the fire and lit the kindling, the flames rising with Ifi by each breath of air. Her hand shook as she held the brand, her eyes refusing to meet the fire, and then she cast it into the flames. The log hissed and groaned, as if it held a voice of its own, unwilling to die, as the fire curled around it and slowly consumed it. Far from that hearth, unaware of his doom, Meleager felt the fire inside him rise. Pain bloomed within his body, unseen flames burning his spirit, each breath harder than the last, and though he knew something was wrong, he held the pain in silence. His strength kept him standing, but even the strongest cannot resist the fire of fate. The agony climbed, then slowly faded, as the last of the log turned to ash and grey smoke floated upward. With it, Meleager's spirit slipped away, silent and unseen, joining the air. His death came not by sword or wound, but by the promise of the fates and the hand of a grieving mother. And in that moment, the threads spun long ago by the Moirai were fulfilled. Whether in the fire that brought Meleager's end, or in the broken spell that allowed Heracles to begin, the Moirai remained at the centre, weaving the lives of mortals without pause. Their decisions were never loud, never cruel in appearance, but they were final. In both tales, the thread was spun, measured and cut, not always with thunder or force, but with quiet inevitability. Their presence was both feared and accepted, for even when challenged by clever minds or broken hearts, the design they created always found its way to completion, has already been twisted into the thread by the hands that never rest. From the very moment a child is born, the Moirai begin their work, silent and steady, without pause, weaving the strand that will determine every moment of that life. The day Heracles was born, their power had been disrupted just for a breath, when the sudden distraction caused their arms to break formation, and the birth pangs of his mother stopped at once. Heracles came into the world, not through divine permission, but by the clever trick of a mortal, and for that trick, the punishment was swift and permanent. The Moirai, aggrieved that their command had been undone, stripped the woman of her dignity, warping her body into the shape of a weasel, a creature meant to be low, creeping, hidden from the world's admiration. Her form was changed cruelly, her manner of mating and birth turned unnatural and grotesque, no longer honored as a woman, but cast into corners, crannies, and shadows. Yet even in that form, she found a place in the sacred, for Hecate took pity on her and claimed her as a servant, granting her a role close to mystery and shadow, just as the Moirai themselves dwell in silence and darkness. Across the wide world, from palace to battlefield, their presence was not shouted, but deeply felt. In every tale, they were the ones behind the veil, spinning, measuring, and cutting, often unnamed, but always present. In the words of ancient poets, they were called spinners, the ones who set the rhythm of a life, not with swords or commands, but with the thread on their distaff. When a man fell in war, when a hero stood tall, when a child cried its first cry, or a king breathed his last, it was their thread that had reached its end. Homer spoke of them often, describing how destiny had woven sorrow or glory from the day of a person's birth. One line of thread spun in joy, another soaked in grief, but none could be changed, for their office was final. In Homer's stories, even the gods, mighty as they were, had to watch mortals live and die under the thread woven by these silent sisters. Mortals suffered because that was what the thread carried, and even when tears were shed, the gods did not grieve, for their lives were not bound by these threads. The Odyssey speaks again of how a man must face what the spinners have already tied into his thread, how no strength, no cleverness, no bravery could undo what had already been fixed the moment he came into the world. In another voice, Bacchylides described them with golden distaffs, dignified, beautiful, and precise. Their work neither cruel nor kind, just unbending. Aeschylus, in his deep tragedies, saw them as relentless, their thread spun without pause or pity, their duty cold but exact. Plato gave them names and placed them in a vision of cosmic order, singing with the sirens, each voice describing a layer of existence, what had been, what is, and what is to come. One turned the outer rim, one the inner, and one lent her hand to all, and through their movements the world's course was shaped. In the strange verses of Lachesis, they were daughters of the sea, spinning brazen threads, strong and sharp, never breaking. He saw them whirl their spindles at great speed, rushing to keep up with the unfolding of events, yet never too fast or too slow. Even Seneca, writing far from the homeland of these myths, could not ignore their weight. He said fate drives all, and no care, no plan, no resistance can stop the thread once it has begun to spin. The spindle turns, the thread unwinds, and every joy, every pain, every victory, and loss has already been marked. The Moirai do not bargain. They do not forgive. They do not change what has been written. They only spin. In every time and every place, their presence has been known, unseen, untouched, but impossible to escape. They are the still center of the world's turning wheel, the silent singers behind every birth, every death, and every destiny fulfilled. Everything that lives walks a path already laid, for what rises from above moves according to decrees that cannot be undone. And Lachesis, with her firm hand, holds tight to the spindle whose design no other hand may reverse. From the moment a life begins, its final day is set, unshakable, and each step follows the one before it in a pattern laid long ago. The causes that give rise to each event are not random, for they are tightly woven together with the fates themselves, and even the gods do not shift what has been sealed in thread. No prayer, no plea, no cry of desperation can move what has already been fixed. Some destroy themselves with fear alone, and many have stumbled into death while trying to escape it, running so hard from their doom that they sprinted into its arms. Death, silent and sure, moves with a blade in hand, cutting the thread spun by the sisters when the time comes, and no thread can resist when its moment arrives. The thread crumbles in Lachesis' hand as the years vanish like dust, dissolving as she spins what little remains. When Amphiaros, the seer, was swallowed by the earth and appeared alive in the realm of the dead, even the distaff of the sisters paused, surprised by his arrival, and in their fear the fates snapped the thread. Yet even such a sight could not break the truth of their work, only speed its fulfillment. The threads they spin must be held tight, and the wool must stretch over the distaff with care, for only then may the approach of death be slowed, but never halted. Atropos, the most final of the three, tears the thread when it is time, and does so without pause, even if the thread is full of health, strength, and brightness. No flourishing life has ever made her hand tremble. Even the king of gods must craft his plans within the boundaries they set, weaving Typhon's fall into the threads of Moira's spindle, knowing that even a stormbringer must fall when the thread says so. And though one may wish to escape the bitterness the spindle has spun, even to plead that the thread obeys the heart's cry, the spindle turns still, and the thread unspools. All who are born of mortal womb are tied to Moira, bound like captives, for she is the spinner, and all follow her thread. She chooses fortune, both good and bad, distributing light and shadow alike, to men and nations across the lands and seas, giving favor and trial, not by whim, but by pattern. In the halls of great kings or the homes of simple folk, she moves unseen, yet always present. One may wish for joy, for happiness carved out of the sky's light, but the gods do not always give such blessings, and those who do not receive them must carry what is given, for to resist is to suffer more. Even heroes, strong and brave, like the son of thunder and toil, were made by the Moirai to bear more weight than any other, their excellence rising from the hardship the thread demanded. Fate does not only grant ease, she gives burden and greatness together, wrapping them in the same thread. She gives gifts, both sweet and cruel, and none can refuse them, for they come from hands that never sleep. The immortals may offer wealth, love, or grief, but all must be taken, for they are sent with no return. From heaven's hand, fate brings happiness wide as the sky, yet in another hour she may bring sorrow just as deep, and both are part of the same thread. Life is not shared equally, and each breath is bound to its own end, not chosen by the soul that breathes it. One man is pulled toward one task, another to a different weight, and neither may trade or delay what has been given. Some walk toward glory, some toward hardship, and others into silence. But each path is drawn from the same spindle. What the Moirai spin is not chaos but order, though no one can see the pattern until the end is reached. And so, from the first breath to the last, every living thing moves not alone, but with the unseen thread winding around its soul, held in the hands of those who spin, measure, and cut without rest. The one who speaks lifts a prayer toward the high-seated spinner and her sisters, those who decide with silent hands and unswerving eyes, hoping they will show favor to the wish of a companion held dear. To speak to them is not to bargain, but to ask with the weight of hope, for they do not change course easily. In the tale of two brothers who drew lots for a kingdom, their fate had already been written into the thread. One would rule the palace, the other would take the gold and flocks and depart. But it was not a decision made by luck alone. When the shards were drawn from the helmet, it was not chance, but the pattern spun long before that chose. And if it was meant that the two would fall by each other's hand, then even the trembling of the lot was only the echo of what the Moirai had already decided. A city may rise and glow with strength when the gods grant favor, but no honor, no greatness among mortals stands if it runs against the will of the deity and the path measured by the hand of the one who draws the thread. Blessings come to those the gods choose to raise, and others find their fortune vanish, undone by the plans that the three sisters have written in silence. When the thread turns, even a heart once full of joy may be led into sorrow. The moment that Deianira's fate was spun, a sorrowful plan unfolded, one she could not see, woven not by her choice, but by the irresistible force that draws each life forward. What is given by the gods, and what is confirmed by the balance of justice, must come to pass. It is not ours to choose our portion, but only to meet it when it comes. People do not choose peace or war or struggle, for the force that grants all things moves like a cloud, shading now one land, now another, without warning. That giver, whether called destiny or the spinner, places shadow where once there was sunlight and moves on. And so prayers rise, calling to the daughters of night, those whose arms are strong and whose minds are unbending, asking them to hear the voice of the city. These feared powers of the heavens and underworld, whose threads are neither cruel nor kind but only true, are asked to send order like a rose in bloom, and justice seated in brightness, and peace wrapped in flowers, so that the city may forget the heavy sorrows of the past. The prophet, before the war that would see towers crumble, said the people would succeed, but not without the violent touch of fate, which would strike down the wealth of the city, driving justice through suffering. On different stones, fate sharpens justice still, and even as one act ends, another begins, the thread twisting into a new knot of pain. The circle of fate does not rest, for as one life ends, another begins its march, pulled forward by the line drawn by hands unseen. But those same powers, when pleased, may also grant peace and delay the touch of death. They may lift the curse and hold back the early end, blessing the land and its people with time, with breath, with calm. Yet this blessing too is written. The fate that holds off destruction is still a fate, chosen and sealed, like all others. There is no escape from the thread, from palace to battlefield, from love to loss, from joy to ruin. It spins onward. The sisters do not stop. They spin in silence, measure in stillness, and cut when the time comes. And mortals, whether kings or beggars, whether brave or afraid, walk forward through the line that has already been laid, to the gentle lives of maidens given in marriage, to the shaping of their fates with husbands and households, The power belongs to those who rule justly and without bias. The Moirai, sisters born of one mother, divine in form and force, and known in every corner of the world of gods and men. These deities visit all homes with their unseen hands and share in every human affair, pressing upon mortals in each season, their presence righteous and heavy, their will honored even by the immortals. Their reach is long, and their judgment is firm, for they see what others do not. They grant fulfillment not by request, but through the course they spin, and through the will of Zeus they guide justice on her path. When a wrong is done, and when a life is taken in betrayal, it is not forgotten. Justice herself cries out that for every word spoken in hatred, another will echo in return, and for every stroke that ends a life, another will rise to meet it. Justice follows the thread spun by the Moirai, and their path cannot be stopped. Not even skill or cleverness can stand against the force that drives all things toward their end. For fate is stronger, and necessity moves with it like a storm with no center. Who, then, guides this storm, this force that holds power even over gods? It is the Moirai, in their threefold form, working beside the avenging spirits, the Furies, who remember every deed and every drop of blood. And when one sees suffering, when pain falls upon a soul like Io, or fear shakes the hearts of the Oceanids who witness the wrath of Zeus, it is fate that they fear most, not the thunder nor the rage of gods, but the unbreakable order written by those who spin the thread. They plead not to be taken by one who descends from the sky, for they know that even love can carry destruction when it moves on the thread of the Moirai. They speak the names of fate and fury, those who give sorrow and who chase justice in black veils, and know that once their hands are set upon a course, nothing can turn it away. When a man sets out on a journey, when he crosses sea and land for a prize beyond his reach, it is not only the will of kings or mortal pride that sends him, it is the pulling thread, long ago cast, that leads him step by step toward what was always meant. And when the woman whose beauty sparked war was cast among men, it was said that the daughters of the sea, lame and wise, had spun 3 threads that gave her 5 husbands, and not one less. The war, the pain, the towers that fell, the spears that broke, it was all the thread spinning fast from brazen spindles, rushing with force none could stop. The Moirai spun, and the war unfolded. They did not weep, nor did they slow. In the heights above the world, where the gods sit veiled in clouds, all things, joy and sorrow, riches and ruin, rest on the knees of powers beyond count. But only the Moirai reach into the folds and take what lies there. They do not choose by sight, nor by mercy. With blind hands they cast what they have taken, dropping it from Olympus to the world below, where it falls like wind, unseen but felt. And so it happens that the wicked grow wealthy, and the good fall into grief. For the hands that drop the pieces do not stop to look. Every man walks blindly, unsure of where his steps will land. The path twists, now rising to joy, now falling to grief. And no one walks it straight. None are blessed from start to finish. All must meet both fortune and misfortune. They come together, never separated for long. And thus it is that in this short life, where time slips like water and days vanish into dusk, none escape the pattern. The good and bad are woven together, and none may pull one without the other. The Moirai, silent and watchful, continue their work, never resting, never pausing. For as long as life is breathed, the thread must turn, and the end must come. It is not fitting to remain in grief, for even when the days seem dark and heavy, hope must not be chained down by sorrow. Instead, let the heart look toward the chance of brighter days. For what has passed was not caused by any one person. No man was the reason for the sorrow, but rather it was the Moirai, the cruel ones, whose reach no mortal can escape. These unseen powers move through the lives of all who walk the earth, touching them without warning. One day they bring sorrow, the next they raise someone up with honor, and none can say why, for their ways are not known. They shape all the joy and suffering in the world as they please, without favor and without explanation. Every step taken through life, whether by land or by sea, passes along paths that are hidden from the eyes of those who walk them, and these roads are not straight but twisted, splitting apart and leading in many directions that no one can truly follow or understand. Like leaves tossed by the wind, people are blown across these paths by the decree of fortune, helpless against her turns. Even the good often stumble into misfortune, and the brave may never find success, for the threads of the Moirai cannot be avoided. They do not spare anyone, and their plans take shape without regard for who deserves what. There are times when the course of fate does not care even for the will of the highest God. The soul of fate is unmoved, and she spins her thread with no pity. She does not consider whether the one she marks is mortal or divine, newborn or dying, strong city or forgotten town. All rise and fall according to her hand. When the gods who stood with Troy sought to stop the wooden horse, it was fate who turned them away. It was her will that turned their hearts against each other, leading them to quarrel rather than act, for she had already chosen the outcome. And when the one who saw clearly, the one whose words were never false, warned them again and again, her voice went unheard. Her truths fell like wind upon the ears of those who would not listen, not because they refused, but because fate had made it so. Her decree was that the city would fall, and nothing, not wisdom, not truth, not the cries of the people, could stop it. When the final blow came, when the city was torn apart and prayers rose from every corner, the gods did not answer. The strong hand of fate watched over all, deciding who would rise and who would fall. Those without a name were raised high, and those once great were cast down into dust. In the turning wheel of life, good often leads to evil, and evil can give rise to good. Everything shifts, and nothing stays the same, for this is how fate works, ever changing yet always certain. And though the affairs of kings seem mighty, their power is no stronger than the thread spun for them. Even if fate gives one man the throne that belonged to another, and even if the rightful one strikes down the other to protect his crown, it does not matter, for the thread is unchangeable. It is spun, and it holds. It does not bend for fear or desire. It does not stop for justice or love. It moves forward, and all are caught in it. The Moirai do not ask, they do not explain, they do not hesitate. They decide, and that decision becomes the road, whether it is walked in peace or in ruin. In their hands, everything finds its place. Unknown paths, silent destinies, and the fall of cities that once stood proud beneath the sky. Even if one were kept from his rightful throne and removed from the land of the living, he would still rise again if the Moirai had decreed it so. For their will cannot be undone, and their thread cannot be cut by force or denied by circumstance. If a man is destined to become a carpenter, then he will become one, even if both his hands have been taken from him, for the craft will still find its way into his being. And if another has been chosen by the Moirai to win the Olympic prize for running, then he will not fail, even if his leg has been broken, because fate does not bend for wounds. If a man is meant to be the greatest archer, he will strike his target even if he has lost his sight. For what the Moirai have written cannot be unwritten, and their threads reach far beyond the limits of flesh and chance. This truth is known even among the gods, who tolerate such thoughts and do not strike down those who speak them, for they too know the limits of their power. Even the king of the gods has heard the cries of sorrow in stories, where he laments the loss of his son and blames the Moirai for taking him, and even he, with all his strength, does not undo what they have said. When Thetis learned of her son's future, she was told by her father that he had only two paths before him, and both had already been measured, either to live a quiet life without glory, or to die young with everlasting fame. She knew then that glory would take him quickly, and her sorrow came not from choice, but from the spinning of that thread. In another story, a girl who loved deeply turned against her father for the sake of the man she adored, but her actions and their outcome were already shaped by the Moirai, and the future of that household, with all its triumph and ruin, followed the course they had laid out. When a kingdom seemed to rise with strength and promise, it was not only fortune but the granting of the Moirai that allowed its path to shine. They gave their consent, and with it the land was able to grow. When one of the brothers was told that the thread of fate gave him equal weight among his kin, he was crowned king, and his name became the name of his people, showing again that their thread decided not only a man's life but also the shape of nations. Even war moved by their command. It was revealed that the war in the distant land would last exactly 6 years, as counted by the turning of the seasons, and not before the 7th cycle would the enemy city fall, for such was the will of Hera and the decree of the Moirai, as measured by the gaze of the sky and the unbending thread. Though the voice of prophecy often came through other gods, it was sometimes said that the power to see the future itself belonged to the Moirai, and only a few were ever granted even a glimpse into what was to come. Their prophecies were not spoken like riddles or guesses, but stood firm like the fabric they wove, which held the archives of the world. In that place, where fate was stored, stood a massive weave made of bronze and steel, untouched by lightning, unshaken by disaster, a structure so strong that even the heavens breaking could not harm it. Within that weave was the record of all things, written not in words but in thread, where time and outcome were bound together, secure and immovable. No god could enter without permission, and no goddess, no matter how powerful, could move the course that was set. When fate was questioned, it was never because it was weak or uncertain. It was because even those who held divine power knew that there was something deeper, something older, something that did not answer to desire. The Moirai did not argue, did not explain, and did not hesitate. They only spun, measured, and cut. Their house stood apart, and their work continued quiet and firm, as all things followed the path they had prepared. From the lives of kings to the dreams of warriors, from the love of maidens to the fall of cities, every thread moved according to their will, and nothing in heaven or earth could change its shape. All eternity holds the records of every soul, and upon unbreakable stone harder than any metal, the fates of an entire line are engraved forever. In those deep archives, where nothing fades and no voice is lost, the fortunes of the future are kept fixed and silent, untouched by time. They are written not in ink, but in the memory of unchanging truth, guarded by powers no hand can sway. One who had seen them spoke of what was held there, having read the lines himself and remembered them clearly, so that others might not wander in darkness, unaware of what lies ahead. From the earliest times, people have been haunted by a hunger to know what comes next, reaching always toward what is hidden, questioning the meaning of the day they were born, the the moment they will die, the thoughts of the high gods, and the decisions of the cold-hearted spinner of the thread. They want to see the pattern, to know the end before the beginning fades, but such knowledge is held tightly. When the spirit of a king was called up from the underworld to speak of the fate of his city, he said he could only speak so far as the spinners of thread and the spirits of vengeance would let him. The words of the dead are not free, and even they must bow to the thread already measured. Below the world, in the realm of silence, where the fates dwell together in their own peace, some believe the souls of the dead learn and teach the future by sharing what the Moirai have shown them, speaking in harmony with the ones who weave destiny. There the lines of prophecy are passed not in scrolls, but through presence and memory, in a place where time moves differently and where the order of what must be is preserved. In life and in death, their power does not break. When war covers the land, when men fight beneath city walls with armor flashing and hearts set on victory or ruin, their fate moves unseen beside them. Some fight to save their homes, others to destroy, and many fall. Around the battlefield, the spirits of death gather, snarling with sharp teeth, fierce and soaked in blood, struggling with each other to claim the souls that are falling. They watch every wound, every stumble, every last breath, for they are hungry for blood and eager for the end. When one warrior falls, one of them springs forward with long claws and drags his soul down to the coal below, to the deep pit that waits for all. And when they have drunk their fill, they throw the body away like a shell and dive back into the chaos for more. Over them stand the Moirai, watching the scene with steady eyes. Clotho spins the thread, Lachesis measures it, and Atropos, the oldest though smallest, cuts it. The spirits of death fight among themselves over one man, tearing at each other with claws and fury, but the thread still leads, and once it ends, nothing remains. The smallest of the three sisters is the one who holds the end, and with one stroke she finishes what the others began. No warrior is spared. Even when greatness burns in a man's eyes, if the Moirai have spun his end, it will come. Destiny and the ancient force of contrivance defeat them all. No skill, no plan, no strength of arms will stop what has been fixed. Even when a father sees the future and knows his sons are meant to destroy each other, he understands that their fate was spun before their first cry, and all his sorrow cannot change the thread. The Moirai have woven it, and so it must happen. No mourning, no warning, no war cry or silence can stop what they have begun. Their thread runs through every life, through every choice, through every rise and fall. Whether in peace or in battle, whether in prophecy or in pain, their work is always the same. They do not speak often, but their silence is stronger than words, and their decisions last longer than memory. They are not cruel, only firm, and once the thread is spun, it cannot be unwound. In life and in death, on the battlefield and in the quiet corners of the world, the Moirai watch and the thread continues. The ferryman of the dead does not wait, and as his voice echoes across the dark waters, he calls out that the boat is leaving, his shout sharp and final. He will not delay, for the command has already come from the one whose will cannot be denied. Gloomy fate summons, and her call must be answered, no matter the fear or the sorrow. Even the greatest cannot escape her reach. Not even a god, not even the highest of them all, could save his own son from the decree that had already been made. The Moirai do not waver, not even before divine pleading. Death comes when they say, and no speech, no power, no wisdom can stop it. A man may be gifted with beautiful words and move the hearts of others with the flood of his voice, but even such skill cannot guard him against the approach of fate. Her face does not smile, and her hand does not tremble. Her thread, once cut, ends all. The gods themselves may weep, may be stirred to sorrow by the sight of death or the sound of mourning, but even their tears do not undo what the ancient sisters have written in iron. Their law is older, their thread unbreakable. There are those who wish that death had come early, that one of the three had chosen to lay them to rest in the cradle before sorrow and struggle had begun. But the Moirai do not ask permission, and they do not offer mercy. While they still spin, life may be enjoyed, for time moves quickly, and the wheel of the year turns fast. Each moment flies by, pulled forward by days with wings. The sisters work without rest, and their spinning never moves in reverse. The thread they weave stretches forward only toward the end they have already measured. Men move forward blindly, unaware of what waits ahead, each one carried by the wind of fate toward a shore he cannot see. None know their own thread, and all move closer to the place where the Moirai wait. When they come, none may refuse. No pleading delays the day they have chosen, and no hand can pull back the thread once they reach to cut it. The urn that gathers the dead fills with nations, each soul hurried along its path, each name recorded in silence. In myths of descent to the underworld, even heroes cry out, hoping to break the laws of death and escape the firm hold of the fates. To tear open the gates of the underworld, to bring light where only shadows remain, is to fight the final order of fate. But even such strength cannot shift the distaffs of the sisters, for what they have spun holds firm. In times to come, even as ships cross vast seas and new paths are made across water, the fates watch and measure, finding in each voyage another life to bring home, another soul to gather, another thread to cut. The sea, though full of promise, becomes a place of gain for the Moirai, who see not the trade but the toll. Cities fall, their lives fading quietly as the sword of death slices through the threads of the sisters, each life a strand suddenly severed. The joy of living dims, and the people, struck by the will of fate, descend into the shadows. Sometimes even survival feels like theft from death, and one who lives among many fallen speaks of how the command of the gods and the power of Atropos, who never changes her mind, passed over him. Doors once shut by fate may never open again, for she who spins and measures is also the one who shuts. And once her will is done, none can say otherwise. The thread crumbles in the hand of the one who measures, for Lachesis, with each twist of her distaff, lays waste to the ages through the ruin of war. Battles rage and lives are lost, not by accident, but because the thread had already frayed. In a rare moment, when the earth opened and swallowed the seer alive, even the fates themselves were startled. His presence in the underworld, still living, caused terror to the spinners, and only then, shaken by the unexpected, did they reach to break the thread. A son, watching time move too quickly, sees his father's days slip away, believing that the Dark Sisters have acted too soon, that the end has come before its time. Yet there is no too soon for them. In the height of joy, when life seems to shine the brightest, the thread is still vulnerable, and it was then that Atropos reached out and tore it with rough, unwavering hands. It did not matter that life was full, or that promise still glowed. When the thread ends, it ends, but sometimes pity stretches the measure. One man, still breathing, still holding to the last bit of life, feels that Lachesis has let his days continue just a little longer, perhaps not for him, but for the one he loves. Another hopes aloud that Atropos will grant a long life to one dear, praying that her hand may slow, and in the whispers of that hope, time continues. For some, she has promised old age, and with it the strength of a name that lasts beyond the body, a life not just lived, but remembered. But for others, the circle is closing, and the threads tighten with each breath. Death's trap surrounds them, and only the last inch of thread remains, waiting for the final cut. Even the mightiest must meet their thread. A god devised a plan, and with it he entwined the deadly thread of fate for a creature of chaos, setting the spindle in motion, because even divine force must work within the structure spun by the Moirai. One may wish to escape what the wreath spindle has decided, to slip past the bitterness written in twisted threads, but the threads do not listen. They are spun, not persuaded. All who are born from the womb of mortals are slaves to the spinner, not because of cruelty, but because all must die. No one escapes. Even when no sign has yet come, the terrible thread already rolls, winding the uncertain path of life, setting the seal of what will be. One who knows the spinnings, who understands their firmness, still cannot change them. The one who watches the sky, who holds the sun itself, knows the boy will fall if given the reins, but allows it anyway because the thread has already spoken. Some fall into water, swallowed by waves, and it is not the sea that takes them, but the thread that guides them there. The thread listens to no plea, and the Moirai obey no voice. In stories old and sung, when men clash on fields of war, when blood covers the ground, one hears always of red death and powerful fate. They fall not just by steel, but because the moment of their end has come. Even the strongest arm, even the loudest cry, cannot stop the red death when the powerful destiny has taken hold. The arm drops, the breath fades, and the thread is cut. It has always been so. For one must fall when death and doom are given, and there is no trading places, no stepping aside, no running past the mark. The line was drawn, the thread was spun, and the end had been waiting all along. The course of life moves forward not by strength or wisdom, but because destiny stands nearby, watching with quiet eyes. When the warrior marched into battle, he did not know that his own fate had brought him to that place, to serve beside the king, and though he fought bravely, it was already decided that he would fall. Some carry more than one fate within them, as told by the one who knew his end before it came. His mother, a goddess of the sea, had told him of two paths, one of short life and everlasting fame, and one of long life with no glory. If he chose to stay and fight, his name would never be forgotten, but he would never return home. If he left the battlefield behind, he would live a long life in the land of his fathers, but his story would fade. He chose the path of fire, and with it came the nearness of death. The one who stood in his armor after him was warned too that his days were numbered. Death stood close, and powerful destiny waited beside it, unseen but certain. In the clash of swords, when the blade rose and fell, the red death closed the eyes of warriors, and fate, just as strong, finished what had been spun long before. The day of destiny came as it does for all, silent and final, and even those who knew could not escape it. Warnings came, even from those who loved, but death still stood near, and fate stood with it, never turning away. In quiet truth, it is known that death touches everyone, and no god, no matter how kind or powerful, can stop it when it arrives. Even for those held dear by the immortals, grim fate still comes on the day appointed. The voice of one shade to another, long after their battles ended, spoke not only of honor but of sorrow. For even the great were brought low, and fate took them by the most bitter means. Some died in battle with glory. Others met more tragic ends far from the clash of swords, Even those who defended their homeland with courage were struck down by the same dark fate. No one can hold more than the span given. Even the best, the strongest, the most noble, cannot command a longer thread than what has been measured. Like birds caught in a great net, mortals move within the bounds of destiny, never seeing the edges, never knowing where the mesh tightens. At moments when life seemed strong and the journey clear, fate stepped in and the end came. One fell as the moment arrived, not by chance, but because it had been decided. Then another followed, the thread cut, the story closed. It was not about who fought hardest or who prayed the loudest. It was about the thread already spun and measured. The journey was long, the battles many, but in the end, the hands of fate made no mistake. Each one fell when the hour came. Each name faded into silence when the thread ran out. And through it all, destiny moved unseen, never slowing, never stopping, always bringing each life to the place it was meant to reach, was fulfilled. There was no more time left to live, and the one to whom that span belonged could go no further, not even one step beyond the place that fate had marked. The one who sought adventure, driven by courage and honor, found that his path was also pulled by something greater. His bravery pushed him forward, but it was the hand of fate that had already set the end of his road. Another, glorious in battle, rose to fight with strength and pride, and fate, though unseen, walked just behind her. She was not stopped at once, but fate gave her a short time, just enough to shine in the eyes of others. For a little while, it held back the shadow and crowned her with triumph. Yet even in that brightness, the path to her end was already drawn. She moved through battle, slaying those who stood before her, but fate stood behind, pressing her gently but firmly toward the moment her own fall would come. Around her, the soldiers fell by her spear, not because she chose it, but because fate allowed it, until her moment arrived. And in that hour, the glory turned to silence, and fate took what it had come for. The power that brings plague and war, the doom that spreads like sickness, moved unseen through the air. It stood beside another hero as he fought, encouraging him, smiling without warmth, and guiding his hand, not toward victory, but toward the last stroke. He fought with courage, unaware that fate stood so close, whispering not with words but with a push, always forward, always toward the final step. This fate, dark and unstoppable, does not pause, not even for the gods. Around all who live, it circles, silent and constant, and no god can turn it aside once it has begun. It does not bargain or delay. It chooses, and when it chooses, no wall can stop it. It came for a young warrior just at the edge of manhood, bold and bright, with no fear in his heart. Fate did not wait for him to grow older. It led him into war and ended him there, before he had fully known life. Another strong man, lost in anger and sorrow, fell not in battle but by his own hand. He was not defeated by an enemy, but by the heavy grip of fate, which clouded his thoughts and led him into darkness. It was fate that turned his path inward, twisting his pride into despair and pushing him toward the end he could not see. Yet even then, his fall was not random. It was the moment that had already been measured. On another field, fate sent a friend to fight for one side, only to meet death beneath a spear. As the blood flowed from his wound, fate stood at his side, silent but present, and waited as he passed from life to shadow. In great battles where men and horses fell together, where blood soaked the ground and wheels crushed bone and armor, fate raged like a storm. It did not choose only one or two. It swept through the crowd like fire, striking without pause, leaving dust and silence in its wake. Thousands fell because fate had decided, and no cry, no shield, no god could stand between them and the end. For each life, the Moirai had assigned a portion. They had measured it, and once it was used, it could not be renewed. The underworld waited, and the thread was already cut. No path turned back, no voice called them home. Each one fell, not alone, but with fate beside them. For that is how it always ends. The thread of life, once measured and spun, reaches its final length, and when that moment arrives, it is cut without hesitation, and death follows at once. The ones who perform this final act are not simply silent watchers, but goddesses with power over the very breath of life, standing close to the throne of the ruler of the underworld. They are not only weavers of destiny, but attendants of death itself, known for ending what once began. In sacred verse, it is said that only those whose lives have been marked by holiness and justice are guided by them into the soft meadows of Elysium, where roses bloom and eternal dance awaits. There, in the fields of light beyond sorrow, those who pass the trials of mortal life join in chorus and step, moving in circles that never end, part of a rhythm that only the good may join. It is by the hand of these goddesses that this grace is allowed, for they permit entry only to those who have fulfilled their lot with honor. In deeper thought, where philosophers place their visions of truth, these same figures are seen beside the throne of the underworld, seated around it in equal balance, each on her own seat, dressed in white and crowned with fillers. They are called daughters of necessity, unchanging and ever-present. One sings of the past, one of the present, and one of what is yet to come. Their song does not rise alone, but joins in harmony with the sirens, whose music shapes the turning of the world. With their hands they guide the spindle of time, turning its circles slowly, steadily, as the fates of mortals unfold. Each hand plays its part, each motion turns the wheel, and as it spins, new lives are chosen. The souls that return for another cycle stand before them and are called to receive their portion. A prophet gathers them, takes lots and life patterns from the lap of the fate who rules memory, and from a high place declares that a new cycle has begun. And with every birth comes the promise of death. Below all this, where shadow rules and the stars are far away, one who has faced death and returned speaks of what he saw. He stepped beyond the threshold, into the realm where night never ends and where things darker than night gather. There he saw gods grim and frowning, saw the fates with their still hands, saw what lies beyond the end. He returned not because fate changed, but because fate allowed it, a rare reversal that only the strongest can endure. In the stories of poets, the fates are named again, sometimes called the Sisters of Elysium, gentle only to those who earned peace, firm always in their duty. In the dark heart of the underworld, the ruler on his black throne listens to the stories of the dead, their deeds weighed in silence. Around him stand the avengers and the shapes of many deaths, each waiting for their task. Chains rattle and punishment stirs, but the fates hold the final authority. They bring the souls forward, and with a gesture, simple, silent, like the turn of a thumb, they pass judgment. So many arrive that even their task grows heavy, yet there are others there who temper the harshness. A judge stands nearby, another beside him, and together they offer calmer thoughts, pulling the balance toward justice instead of vengeance. Still, the power remains with the ones who spin, measure, and cut. It is they who assign the soul its fate. It is they who decide whether it rests in peace or turns again through the wheel of birth. And when they choose, no one can say otherwise. They stand always near, unseen by most, yet shaping every ending. They are not cruel, but they are certain. And once the thread ends, their hands do not tremble. They do not speak often, but when they do, the world listens. In silence and in shadow, in brightness and in death, their work remains. Their thread, once spun, is watched with care, and when it reaches its end, it is cut. And what follows is what has always followed, what they have always known, what they have always allowed. Whenever a shade entered the land of the dead, having earned the true love and praise of a faithful spouse, Persephone, the queen of the underworld, often showed grace and favor. She welcomed such souls into Elysium, the peaceful land of the blessed where light still touched the air and sorrow never followed. So it was that Priscilla, having passed from the world of the living, entered the kingdom below with gentle steps and pure heart. Once there, she lifted her hands in prayer, humbly appealing to the fates, those ancient weavers of destiny, asking that her beloved be granted long years of peace. She did not ask for her own sake, but pleaded on behalf of her husband, wishing only that he might live out his full mortal span, his rule still steady, his youth still untouched, bringing calm and stability to the world. The Moirai, those three sisters who held all the threads of life in their hands, listened to her prayer, and they made a solemn oath to grant her wish. They, who rarely swayed from the paths they wove, gave her a vow, binding themselves to honor her request, letting her love reach beyond death to touch the world above. But while some prayers were heard and honored, others broke against the will of fate like waves on stone. For when one acted in defiance of destiny, such deeds echoed with darkness. Murder, especially, tore at the fabric of fate itself. It was not merely a crime of the mortal world, but an act against the very order the Moirai had established. Those who took life wrongly brought about a disruption, one that could not go unanswered. In such times the Erinyes, born of night and ever watchful, rose to action. They were the agents of the Moirai, fierce spirits of vengeance who upheld the weight of law when blood cried out from the earth. Their duty was sacred, given at the beginning, and they did not stray from it. When Aegisthus slew the returning husband of the son of Atropos and claimed his wife, he did more than commit a crime of passion. He crossed the boundary drawn by the fates. The gods themselves watched as Zeus reminded the immortals that men often blame the divine for their troubles. Yet it was by their own arrogance they brought ruin. Aegisthus had taken what was not meant for him and died for it, struck down by the hand of the sun seeking justice. Even in cases where shame rose among kin, when violence came from within one's own blood, the fates turned away their gaze, hiding their eyes from what was never meant to be. So deep was their sorrow for such defiance. Apollo too once served a mortal, his divine will humbled under the order of Zeus and the will of the Moirai, all for a murder done long before, a punishment for blood spilled from the hands of the Cyclops. The Moirai had decreed it, and not even Apollo could escape. The Erinyes spoke of this right, spun into them by the fates, a law that was not written by hand but by thread, woven into the world itself. Their power was not given by other gods, but was born with them, fixed and eternal. They did not ask permission, for their duty was older than many thrones. They stood as guardians of the boundary between rightful death and wrongful killing, and their presence brought fear and awe to all. Even the gods respected their domain, knowing that once the Moirai had spun a thread, and once the Erinyes had taken up their cause, no one could undo the judgment. The words of vengeance that came from them were not wild threats, but echoes of fate itself. They warned of the law that governed life and death. a law not made by kings, but carried out through time by the will of those ancient sisters. And when they spoke of the Moirai, they did so with reverence, calling them their sisters, daughters of night, honoured at every hearth, shaping justice across all lands. They were the highest even among the immortals, for it was they who held the beginning and the end of every life. When vengeance came for Aegisthus, murderer of the returning king, it was not just a man seeking justice. It was the blade of fate returning to balance what had been broken. The sword did not strike in madness, but in the rhythm of a law older than memory, and the Erinyes watched as the thread that had been knotted was finally cut, restoring order once more. Blow after blow rang out at the command of justice, for the one who dared to act against the sacred authority of the highest God lay broken and defeated, his wrongdoing crushed beneath the weight of divine judgment. The anvil of justice stood unmoving and eternal, and upon it destiny worked swiftly, forging her weapons without hesitation. Her arms were shaped with purpose, and her sword gleamed with readiness, for the time had come. The Fury, fierce and unyielding, remembered every drop of blood that had been spilled long ago, and with her deep and brooding gaze, she moved toward the house where the crime had once taken place. She did not forget, and she did not forgive. Now she returned, bringing with her the son, born of that same blood, to answer the old stain with a new blow, to fulfill the doom that had long waited. In the house where betrayal once ruled, the avenger now approached. The one who had slain her husband had tried to build her life around her son, but he now stood before her, filled with judgment. She cried that fate must bear some of the blame for her act, and he replied that the same fate now drove his hand, bringing the cycle of blood full circle. The laws of necessity, unbreakable and eternal, were not held by any one God but guided by those ancient and unwavering powers. The Fates, who spun all threads, and the Furies, who remembered all wrongs. These powers stood beyond even the gods' reach, and even when asked who held command over necessity, the answer came with certainty. It was the Fates and the Furies, the ones who never forgot, who kept the record of every wrong. The robe of the Fury, dark and terrible, fastened tightly across her chest, was crafted by Death and the Queen of the Underworld herself, made new and fresh for each act of vengeance, woven again and again for each soul that called for justice. But even the final act of despair, the taking of one's own life, was seen by some as an offense to the order of destiny. One Roman voice cried out that the one who died by his own hand had not only defied the gods, but had also forced his way past the fates themselves, slipping through the gates of death without their consent, rushing into the shadowed realm against the order they had written. Yet even in this firm grip of fate, there were moments, rare, shining, and strange, when the fates themselves stepped aside. In the tale of the boy who was slain and boiled in a pot, then served to the immortals by his father, there came an impossible moment. The god of the sea, moved by love and longing, stepped forward and lifted the child's body from the cauldron. Clotho, the one who spun the thread of life, touched the remains, and from her hands the boy returned to life. Where flesh had been lost, a shining shoulder of ivory was given in its place, and he stood again, not as a memory, but as a living being. In another moment, when a god had once served a mortal, he used that bond to plead for mercy. For the one he cared for, he approached the fates themselves, and through sweet words and poured wine, he persuaded them to grant what was never meant to be, that a mortal might delay his death, that the thread might be held back, if only for a time. The ancient goddesses, guardians of the old ways, were swayed by what they had never known before, and a rule that had never been broken was, just once, undone. That man was given a chance, a small light in the long shadow of fate, and though the fates rarely changed their weaving, in that moment they allowed a strand to loosen. The son of Pheres had been doomed, but the god secured a gift from the fates, the promise that if another would take his place, then he could continue living. That was not an escape from death, but a reshaping of its path, granted by those who rarely showed such grace. Thus, across all tales, from vengeance to reprieve, from judgment to resurrection, the presence of the fates was firm. Whether they struck swiftly, guided the hand of the avenger, turned away from the shamed, or yielded to the plea of a god, the thread always returned to them. In every path, their fingers moved unseen, and whether by their iron will or rare kindness, they shaped the story of every soul. When the moment had come for him to die, a chance remained, not a refusal of death, but a rare condition shaped by fate itself. He would be spared only if another offered to die in his place. The thread of his life, already measured and marked, could still be held back, but not without cost. It was a gift allowed only through the will of the fates, and they did not bend easily. Yet even against their stubborn pattern, there were moments when powerful hands and brave hearts made a difference. One such hand belonged to the mighty hero who had walked among gods and mortals. He declared that he would not simply accept the final thread as it lay, but that he would grasp the strands of destiny itself, seizing them from the fates, and stretch the wool upon their spindles with his own strength. He could conquer even death, pulling a soul back from the edge. When the woman gave her life for her husband, laying herself down so that he might go on living, he intervened, facing the very heart of the underworld and demanding her return. Though death does not usually reverse, and the path to Lethe is final, his power pressed upon the unyielding. Yet still the question echoed, could the fates be moved? Could the grim forces beyond the river be softened? It seemed that they could, for she who had gone in love's name was returned again, her sacrifice undone through strength and pleading. The king of the underworld, unshaken in judgment and cold in command, found himself shamed. He remembered the time when the shadows were stirred by a voice and a lyre, when a man sang so sweetly that even the terrible ones wept. The gates of Tartarus had opened then, not for war or theft, but for a sorrowful song. The Furies themselves, who forget no blood, had shed tears, and the fates, though unwilling, repeated their work, guiding the lost soul back, only to draw her again to darkness when hope was broken. That same question came again. Could the river be crossed both ways? Could the passé be softened by sorrow? Could the strings of fate be unstrung by music? And there were others too, few but remembered, those who returned from below, not by their own will, but by the strange permission of the three sisters, the goddess who searched for her stolen daughter, walking with fury and grief into the dark, the god who descended for his mother, seeking her among the shades and raising her to brightness, the hero who was sent to bring the hound of the dead to light, breaking the borders between the worlds, the healer born of divine light who touched the secrets of life and death, the twin stars who shared life, taking turns with breath and rest, the messenger, swift and silent, passing in and out without end. These returns were not acts of rebellion, but were bound in quiet agreements, written in the spinning of fate itself. Even the king of all gods once said, of the one held below, that she could rise again, but only if she had not tasted the food of death. That was the law spoken by the fates and fixed in place. The one who ate in the land of the dead was bound to it. And still, there were stories not only of return, but of release from the very state that the fates had first given. One such tale spoke of the centaur, born to be eternal, meant never to know death. He lived with wisdom and skill, but when the wound of poison came, the pain was greater than his immortality could bear. He did not seek to live longer, but to be free from living. And the gods, hearing his wish, did what none expected. They allowed the thread, which should never have ended, to be cut. The fates, with their threefold form, unspooled it, giving him at last the death he desired. In that strange moment, immortality itself was set aside, not as punishment, but as mercy. And through these many paths, through bargains and pleadings, songs and strength, through great pain and great love, the fates, ancient and unmoved, sometimes allowed a change. Though rare and never taken lightly, the lines they wove could, on occasion, be rethreaded, loosened, or unbound. Whether through return, exchange, or release, the story spoke not just of endings, but of moments when destiny, though written, allowed a new line to be drawn. Among the many transformations after death, into birds, animals, plants, or stars, there are only a few moments where the fates are shown guiding such change. One such moment is found in the story of the youth beloved by the god of light, where in the ancient Spartan land, a sacred altar stood adorned with carved figures of the divine. There, beside the Earth Mother, the Queen of the Underworld, and the Lord of the Dead, stood the three fates, woven into the very fabric of divine presence. Alongside the seasons and other goddesses, they were shown carrying the beautiful Hyacinthus to the heavens, lifting him from the mortal world and giving him a place among the stars. His sister was carried with him, and the two rose not through struggle but through divine embrace, taken upward by those who spin and cut the threads of all mortal life. It was not a violent end, but a movement from one state of being to another, a sacred passage wrapped in mourning but also in beauty, with the fates not punishing but lifting. Another story, filled with sorrow and love, told of a youth taken by death while under the favor of the god of wine. The boy, beloved and radiant, was struck down by a bull, and his passing brought grief to one who rarely mourned. But in the heart of that sorrow, something impossible took place. The threads of fate, once thought unbreakable, were loosened. The most unyielding of the three, whose word never turned back, lifted her voice in a rare moment of mercy. She declared that the boy would not cross the river of shadows, that his essence would not vanish into the silent lands. Instead, he would become something else, something new. No longer just a memory or shade, he would be transformed into a vine, a living symbol of joy and renewal, giving forth nectar to the world. His change would not be mourned but celebrated, with music and dance, with the rhythm of fingers and the sound of flutes echoing his name. Songs would rise in his honor, and his story would live on in melody and drink, offered in feasts and remembered in laughter. The muses would praise him, and the god who loved him would find comfort not in forgetting, but in remembering through transformation. The god would trade his crown of serpents for tendrils of vine, letting go of death's sharpness and holding on to the sweetness of what was left behind. The boy's legacy would stretch far, even challenging the memory of another youth once lifted to the sky. For while one brought bronze and war, the other brought the red river of wine, flowing like joy across the land. One brought metal, the other brought gold. Where one gave swords, the other gave song. And in this story, mourning turned into offering, and death became not an end, but a beginning of something that touched the lives of many. In both tales, it was the fates who stood not as destroyers, but as guides, not only cutting life short, but sometimes shaping a path beyond the ordinary, lifting souls into new forms and letting them live on, not through breath, but through beauty and meaning. The fates, so often feared, were in these moments seen as those who could, under rare and powerful emotion, twist their threads not just toward endings, but toward transformations, placing the lost into constellations, into vines, into stories that never faded. Their role was not undone, but it was shown to hold more than severity. It held the ability to carry, to uplift, to mark certain deaths not with silence, but with song. A heart once full of joy now grieved, and even the god of wine who brought laughter and celebration was seen in sorrow, shedding tears so that mortals might find comfort for their own. As the Divine One spoke and departed with her sisters, something rare and strange began to unfold before the eyes of the mourning god. What had once been the lifeless body of the beautiful youth slowly stirred and began to shift, not through mortal magic, but through a sacred transformation shown as a miracle. The boy, once dead, began to rise and take the shape of something entirely new, no longer flesh and bone, but now becoming one with the nature itself. His body bent and lengthened, turning into the creeping form of a snake that slithered along the earth. And then slowly, that serpent form became the plant that would carry his spirit forever. His belly stretched into a long, slender stalk, and his fingers extended upward, becoming tendrils that curled gently with growth. His feet no longer walked the earth but took root in it, grounding him to life again. The soft curls of his hair grew into clusters of grapes, heavy and full. His fawn skin, once worn in youth, was replaced with the vibrant bloom of ripening fruit. His neck became a cluster of grapes, his elbow transformed into a branch thick with berries, and his head changed until even the horns reshaped into bunches of twisted, rich fruit. All across the land a vine began to spread, growing in countless rows, stretching far and wide as a living memory of what once was. It was not only a change of form, but a continuation of being, a passage from one kind of life into another, granted not by rebellion against the divine order, but by the subtle shift allowed through divine mercy. And the god of wine, witnessing this transformation, spoke in awe of how even the threads of fate, usually so unchanging, had turned soft for the boy's beauty. Even the lord of the underworld had grown gentle. Even the queen of the dead had set aside her sternness, letting the boy live again in a new shape, not as shadow, but as vine, preserved in love for the god who mourned him. The strength of that emotion had reached beyond death and softened the edges of what once could not be undone. Elsewhere, in the mysteries of knowledge and language, it was said that the three fates themselves, known for measuring life and death, were also the creators of 7 letters of the alphabet, symbols which held not only sounds, but deep mystical meaning tied to the shape of destiny. These letters, carved into time and memory, served not only for speech, but for signs of things to come, woven into oracles, fate-marked names, and ancient writings where prophecy and life crossed paths. In this way, the ones who ruled over endings also helped shape the very tools of understanding. Over time, other goddesses too were seen as being one with the fates, or as sharing their power in different ways. One of these was the goddess of love and birth, who, in a temple bearing her name, was written to be the eldest of all those called fates. Her rule over creation and life was such that even the 3 who spun and measured mortal days were said to follow her will when it came to bringing life into being. Her decree moved all things that were born, and everything that came into the world passed through her touch. She did not only oversee love, but the deep and ancient force of creation itself, and in that she shared the space with the fates. Another was the goddess of fortune, called by some more powerful than the fates themselves. She moved through life unseen, bringing chance and change, lifting one and lowering another. Where the fates set the length of a thread, fortune determined where it might lead, by calm or storm, by gain or loss. One poet even agreed that she was one of the fates, more influential than her sisters, and closer to the shifting paths of mortals than anyone could understand. And there was the goddess of childbirth, who helped bring new lives into the world. In her presence, the work of the fates began. She was called the servant of the deep-thinking ones, the helper at the very edge of life, where the first breath was taken. One hymn even called her the good spinner, naming her with the same word as fate, and said she was older even than the king of time, linking her directly to the weaving of existence itself. Through her, every birth began, and in her hands the threads were drawn into the world. In these many forms and stories, the fates were not alone, but part of a wider world of goddesses who shared in the making and shaping of life. They touched everything from the final breath to the first cry, from the written letter to the growing vine. Sometimes they changed, sometimes they allowed change, and sometimes they were seen in others, guiding, creating, spinning the path of life in ways seen and unseen. And so their presence remained ever present in every transformation, every chance, every birth, and every name written across the pages of time. Cronus, time. The thread of this goddess reached even before the reign of the father of the gods, showing how her presence was felt from the very beginnings, older than time himself. In the songs of old, the voices that rose to honor the fates were clear and solemn. The Orphic hymn to the fates called them daughters of night, beings with many names, and asked them to come forth, drawn by the sacred scent of incense. They were said to dwell by a hidden lake, where white waters surged from a fountain, buried deep beneath the surface, flowing through a dark and stony cave, far from the eyes of the world. In that deep, unseen place they remained, yet their power spread across the whole earth. Their influence touched every living person, reaching into the lives of people who often felt joy, made plans, and lived as though their time would never run out, even though they were destined to fade. The hymn spoke of how these goddesses concealed themselves in veils of purple, their presence hidden from human sight, as they moved with purpose through the plain of fate, riding together in a chariot guided by glory. They carried out their duties as commanded by ancient law, laws that were vast and flawless, rules that governed all things. These laws did not change. The hymn declared that only fate could see everything clearly, and she alone watched over the choices of mortals. She was described as the eye of Zeus, ever watchful and eternal, and both Zeus and fate observed all deeds. The hymn called the fates by their names, Atropos, Lachesis, and Clotho, asking them to listen with kindness and keep away suffering, to accept the offerings with peace in their hearts. In another song, they were asked to lend their ears, as the closest of all deities to Zeus's throne, who wove their countless and unbreakable plans, using shuttles made not of wood or bone, but of adamant, strong and eternal. Alongside destiny, they worked, daughters of night with strong arms, feared by all, gods and mortals alike. The singers begged them to send order, justice, and peace to the city, asking for an end to its sorrow and for these bright-throned goddesses to bring harmony. In another inscription at a shrine, the fates were mentioned among the most honored deities, standing beside the healer, the twin sons of Zeus, the Graces, the Muses, and others. All were greeted in the same breath, a gathering of immortals who shaped the world through health, beauty, song, and destiny. In the natural world, even the animals were tied to these powers. The common dusky turtle dove, unlike the bright ones linked to goddesses of love and harvest, was said to belong to the Fates and the Furies, a sign of their presence in even the smallest forms of life. They did not need temples alone to be known, for the flutter of dark wings could signal their watching eyes. Still, they had sacred places, and one such place was the high hill in a city of stone, where on the Acropolis above Corinth, a temple was raised in their name. There, their presence was honored, their images perhaps carved or painted, their names spoken in rituals and remembered in prayers. The temple stood as a sign that their influence was not just imagined, but known, worshipped, and feared. From the dark corners of caves to the heights of city walls, from hymns sung in soft tones to birds seen flying under clouded skies, the Fates were everywhere, weaving their silent designs. Their touch was not always seen, but always felt, and their names were spoken in reverence, never lightly, for their will was final, their power immense, and their thread the measure of all things. The Moirai and the goddesses Demeter and Persephone had sacred images, but these were not shown openly to the public, kept hidden from view in deep reverence and secrecy. Their presence was not in grand display, but in silence and mystery. Along the road that led from Sichon to Phlius, after travelling some distance and crossing the river Atropos, there stood a grove filled with holm oaks, and in that quiet place was a temple. The goddesses worshipped there were called the Semnai by the Athenians, and the Eumenides by the Sicyonians. They were honoured once a year with a solemn festival. On that day, sheep heavy with the young were offered as a burnt sacrifice. The people did not crown the altars with wreaths, but brought flowers instead, and they poured libations not of wine but of honey and water. It was an offering both sweet and pure. These same rites were observed at an open altar in the grove, dedicated to the Moirai, who were worshipped under the same trees. In another city, far to the south, the people of Sparta also gave honour to the Fates. There they had a sanctuary built for them, and close by was the grave of Orestes, the son of Agamemnon, whose story was deeply tied to the threads of destiny. In Olympia, the land of games and sacred competitions, there was an altar bearing the name to the bringer of the Fates, which clearly referred to Zeus. He was called this because he alone was said to know all that the Moirai gave to mortals and all that was destined for them. Near that place stood another altar, long and rectangular, dedicated directly to the Moirai, not far away, near the town of Ecosesium in Arcadia. As one walked toward the temple of Despoin, there was a portico to the right. Along its wall, carved in white marble, were reliefs showing the Moirai alongside Zeus, again named as the guide of fate, standing with them in power and knowledge. In Thebes, one of the great cities of central Greece, along the road from the Nystan Gate, there were 3 sacred places close together. The first was the sanctuary of Themis, with a statue made of white marble. Next to it was the sanctuary of the Moirai, though no images of them were placed there, just the space and spirit left for their unseen presence. The third sanctuary was for Zeus as the god of the marketplace, carved from stone, standing between judgment and commerce. In Delphi, where the great oracle gave voice to the god's will, within the temple of Apollo stood 2 images of the Fates, but where the third sister would usually be, instead there stood Zeus and Apollo themselves, both called the guides of fate, as if they had stepped into her place to watch over the turning of destinies. Far away, across the sea, on the island of Cortira, there was another act of remembrance. Medea, long after her journey, built altars near the shrine of Apollo the shepherd, and each year those altars were covered with offerings. These gifts were made not only to the nymphs of the island, but also to the Moirai, whose threads continued to wind through every shore and shadow, through every island and altar. Each place, each temple, each image or absence of image spoke of reverence, of the invisible strength the fates held over all. Whether hidden in silence or called by name, they were everywhere, on roads and in groves, on altars under the open sky, in temples beside other gods, standing or uncarved but always felt. Their worship was not loud but lasting. It moved in solemn rituals, in quiet libations, in simple flowers, in sacred titles shared with the mightiest gods. Whether they were known as the Moirai, the Semnai, or the Eumenides, they were the ones whose hands guided every life, whose presence needed no statue to be real. In city after city, grove after grove, the people remembered. The Moirai were not always seen, but they were never forgotten.